the Kent coast, in the autumn of 1819. It was the settled conviction of the whole of Weymouth, a conviction the town had come to, as the most comfortable convictions always are, by admiring the front of a thing and never once troubling to walk round to the back of it, that a wharf was to be trusted in exact proportion to its stonework. The little bonded wharf of Ballards did its business, as it had done these 40 years, from behind a plain oak counter and a crown-locked warehouse of weathered brick at the head of a muddy tidal creek, over whose low door the name had been painted so long ago that the weather had taken the shine off it. The great new, grand bonded basin, dug that very autumn out of the saltings below the town, and floated upon a handsome London prospectus that the whole neighborhood had scrambled to subscribe, did its business from behind a range of new stone offices, so white and so tall that a farmer bringing down his wool to ship felt he had wandered by mistake into a place of worship, and lowered his voice accordingly. And the town, being human, drew the human conclusion, and carried its trade down the creek from the plain old wharf to the marble one, cask by cask and bale by bale, in the settled certainty that a company which could afford so much cutstone must be very safe to deal with indeed. It is worth the setting down, because it is the whole of the story that follows, for the sea keeps a truer book than any man, and it can be neither flattered nor frighted into swearing to a lie. The water stands where the moon appoints it, and stands nowhere else. And where the tide has never been, no gentleman's oath and no grand new company can float so much as a ship's boat, though they pave the entire quay with marble to say otherwise. For it is one of the small mercies of a coast that it cannot be argued with. A town may talk itself into anything. A prospectus will prove whatever its projector is paid to prove. A company may put up pillars until it has convinced the whole of Kent that a hole in the ground full of borrowed money is the safest place in England to leave a cask of Hollands. But the tide comes in when the moon says it shall, and not a quarter of an hour sooner. And it goes out again, and takes the water with it, and leaves the mud, and no amount of subscription will keep a laden hull afloat upon a flat of ooze in which a heron may wade dry to the knee. That was the one fact in the whole affair that could not be got round, bought off, or talked over, and it was known in the October of this history to exactly one person of any consequence in Weymouth. And she was a woman whom the principal gentleman of the neighborhood was about to advise, before the assembled quality of the coast, to take her opinions to the fish quay and sell them for herring. On a bright, blowing October forenoon, at the grand opening of the basin, the new stone scrubbed, a cold collation laid out under a striped awning, the subscribers gathered to congratulate one another upon the fortune they were all about to make. Crispin Docker, Viscount Ashe, delivered the judgment that the coast would be repeating, with steadily increasing enjoyment, and at his own expense, for the better part of 2 years. He was the basin's chief proprietor, and the head of its board. The whole concern had been got up chiefly on the strength of his name and his acres, and a great many opinions he had formed in town upon the science of commerce, the freedom of trade, and the picturesque uselessness of the old tide-bound sufferance wharves that could take a laden ship alongside only for the few hours about the top of the water. In his gloved hand lay the elegant printed prospectus of the affair, drawn by a fashionable London projector named Prout, who had never in his life stood upon a quay at the very bottom of the ebb and watched the water go out from under a grounded hull, and who had demonstrated with beautiful figures that a basin dug deep enough to float any vessel at any hour must in a very few years engross the entire bonded trade of the coast, and leave the little wharves to the mud and the samphire. A young woman who had come down the quay with her father, present upon the family's business and asked for her opinion by nobody at all, had just observed, in a level and unhurried voice, that the basin's own books already showed more spirits entered in bond than its cellars could ever have room to hold, and that a bonded warehouse was worth exactly what the king's officer could find under lock. In it the morning he came to count. The Viscount did not look up from the prospectus. Tides are the business of fishermen and of the moon, Miss Ballard, not of counting houses. Leave the water to the one and the king's ledgers to the men who keep them. And then, still without lifting his eyes, in the tone a gentleman keeps for a drought under an ill-hung door, a tide book is a fishwife's almanac. It is not evidence, and you are not a clerk. If Miss Ballard has views upon the bonding of spirits, Mr. Kite, she may retail them upon the fish quay, where I am told a timid opinion will always fetch its price in herring, provided it is offered often enough and over baskets small enough to excuse it. Within the month, Hester Ballard had staked the whole life of her father's wharf upon the very book he had called A Fishwife's Almanac. And by the spring after the winter that this history turns upon, for this is the end of the story, and we shall come round to it in good order, but it is only fair you should know from the first what road the tale is travelling. The Viscount of Ashe, the most modern and the least anxious gentleman upon the whole of that bench, would be standing bare-headed at that same plain oak counter, with his tall hat held against his breast, asking the terms of the young woman he had not, that October, troubled himself to look at, and the little wharf he had offered to buy up and pull down, as a man buys a cottage to be rid of it for the sake of the view. Would be, by the common consent of the very coast that had laughed at her obstinacy all the winter through, the one bonded house between the Downs and the Nore, that had never once cost the king a shilling of his duty, nor a merchant a farthing of his goods, and when his aunt asked him, with the family plainness, what in heaven's name he had meant that morning under the new awning, his lordship would discover, to his very considerable discomfort, that he could not for the life of him remember what he had meant by it at all. But that is a year and some months on. This is the October before, and we must begin where she began, which was, as it happened, standing in the cold of the bond cellar of Ballard's Wharf, with a horn lantern and a worn brass tide gauge, reading the last of the springtide entries against the vessels her house had lying in the creek, a full hour before the Viscount pronounced her caution a thing for the fish quay, and thinking of nothing on this earth grander than whether the wind would hold in the east another day, and let the Dutch galliot in over the bar before the springs took off. Hester Ballard, Hetty to nobody, for she had never once invited it, Miss Ballard to the town, and the Ballard girl to such persons as felt her continued existence wanted a syllable of apology, was 27, the only daughter of Gideon Ballard of Weymouth, wharfinger, sole holder of the little bonded wharf that had answered the creek's plain needs for 40 years and never yet lost a customer the worth of a rope yarn. Her mother was 20 years gone. Her father, left with a grave, watching daughter who asked what things cost and remembered the answer, did the only sensible thing a busy man could, and put her to use. She had kept the tide book and the bond ledgers, and weighed the king's duty across that counter since she was 18. She could tell you to the half hour what the water would be doing over the bar on any tide of the coming month, and to the cask how much cognac and Hollands and tobacco lay under the crown lock in her father's cellars, and how much duty stood against it. And she had, besides, a rule her father had taught her, as other fathers teach a catechism. A bond is a promise, Hester, old Gideon liked to say, and the duty is the payment, and any man alive can swear you a handsome promise. Never mind the front of the warehouse, nor the fine talk of credit and consols. Ask only what the tide was doing the night the thing is sworn to have happened. Read the water, and never trust the face of a man's oath against it, for the tide was there or the tide was not, and there is no third thing between. It is necessary to say plainly, because the parlors of the town said it often, and a good deal less kindly, what Hester Ballard was not. She was not a beauty, though a long way from plain. She had a clear, composed, attending face, and a way of looking at whoever was speaking as though what they said might presently be weighed against the tide table and the truth of it. She was not accomplished. She could cast up 3 columns of goods and 2 of duty faster than the collector's own clerk, but she could not sing, and had let her drawing lapse at the age when other young ladies took it up. And she was not married, a circumstance the town laid at the door of the ink upon her fingers, and her unwomanly ease about a bond seller, and her father at the door of the poverty of the arithmetic that had so far offered itself. For she had observed early that a solvent wharfinger's only daughter draws a particular sort of suitor, had priced that sort with accuracy, weighed him, and found him light, and had declined to give good coin for him. She had, in short, all the qualities that make a woman invaluable behind a counter and invisible in a drawing-room, and had made her peace with the exchange a good while before the Viscount of Ashe came down from town to teach her, as he supposed, the difference between the two. That she was not to be trifled with in the matter of a cargo. The whole trade had known these 4 years, since the business of the Norwegian timber brig, and it is worth the telling, for it is the same woman doing the same thing that she would presently do to a lord. A master had come to Ballard's at 23, wanting to enter a deck cargo of deals that he swore had come up the creek on the night's flood and been landed regular, and old Gideon, being tired and the man being plausible, would have signed. But his daughter had gone to the tide book, and had come back and said in the level voice that she was very sorry, but that no brig drawing what his drew had come up that creek on the night he named, for it had been the 3rd day of the neaps, and there had not been water on the bar to swim a coal barge, and would he perhaps like to think again which night it had truly been, and whether the deals had truly been landed at Ballard's at all, or somewhere lower down and quieter. The master had gone away without his certificate and without his temper, and it had come out within the 12-month that the deals were another man's, run in below the town, and passed off as bonded to cover a fraud on an underwriter. And the saving of £400 and the whole good name of the wharf had been owing to a young woman who could read a printed almanac and would not sign her father's hand to a night the moon forbade. The trade had laughed about it and shaken its head and called her a sharp piece, but the trade had also, quietly, brought its honest cargoes to Ballard's ever after, which is the only kind of compliment a wharf can bank. It will be as well, before we go on, to say what manner of thing it was that the Viscount proposed to pull down. A bonded wharf, or a sufferance wharf, was a place licensed by the Crown to land and to keep, under the King's own lock, and beneath the eye of the King's own officer, goods that had come from over the sea with the duty upon them, not yet paid. Cognac, Geneva, Hollands, tea, tobacco, wine, all the dear temptations that a nation lately at war had taxed to the very hilt, so that a merchant might warehouse his cargo in bond and pay the duty by degrees as he sold, and not all in a lump the day it came ashore. The whole of it stood or fell upon one thing, and one thing only, and that thing was honesty, that every cask entered under the lock was truly there, and every cask taken out was truly paid for, and the King's officer might come on any morning of the year, count the cellar against the book, and find the two agree to a gallon. For 40 years the two had agreed at Ballard's to a gallon. Old Gideon had outlived 2 collectors and 4 tide surveyors, and not one of them had ever found so much as a broached anchor unaccounted, nor a keg run out of his cellar by the back way at the bottom of the ebb, and the tide book that his daughter kept was the reason, for it was the plain, unarguable record of every hull that had ever lain at his wharf. The day and the height and the hour of her tide, her draught of water loaded and light, the berth she took and the berth she could not, and every package landed from her, and every package cleared. A ship could no more come to Ballard's against that book than she could sail up the High Street. It was a coast, too, that gave a bonded wharf its peculiar importance and its peculiar peril, for the whole of that shore had run goods since before the memory of the oldest man upon it, and the long war lately ended had only sharpened the trade to a finer point. Every cove and creek from the Downs to the Nore had its dark reputation and its quiet fortunes made in the small hours, a nation that had taxed its spirits and its tea to the very hilt to pay for its battles, had by that same act set a standing bounty upon the running of them, and half the gentry of the coast drank their smuggled cognac with a clear conscience, and never once asked at what state of the tide it had come ashore. Against all this the king had set his sufferance wharves and his crown locks and his tide surveyors, a thin and a corruptible line. And the one witness in the whole of that apparatus who could be neither drunk with, nor bought, nor talked over, nor sent for a soldier, was the tide itself, which came and went upon the moon's business and cared nothing whatever for the revenue or the runners either. A wharfinger, who kept a true tide book, therefore kept, almost without meaning to, the one honest set of books upon a dishonest shore, and it had been the quiet pride of 3 generations of Ballards that theirs was the wharf the revenue never needed to watch, and the runners never troubled to approach. Because everybody upon both sides of that long secret game knew that whatever came in at Ballards came in at the top of an honest tide and was entered fair, and whatever went out paid. It was not a glamorous distinction, and it had never once made them rich. But it was the thing that stood, in the December of this history, between an aging man and a debtor's cell, and it was kept, entry by entry and tide by tide, in a woman's hand. Of Gideon Ballard himself there is not a great deal to say, except that he was a good and honest and frightened old man, which is a harder thing to be than either of the first 2 alone. He had kept his wharf straight through a long war and a longer peace by the simple and exhausting method of never once doing anything he would mind the king's officers seeing, but he was aging now, and short of breath and easily alarmed. And the coming of the boatswain had frightened him more than any gale in 50 years, for a gale he understood, and a company he did not. He had begun to lean upon his daughter in the way the old lean upon the young, when the world changes its shape faster than they can follow. Half in gratitude and half in a querulous fear that she would do something bold and bring the great new gentleman down upon them. And it was one of the quieter heroisms of that autumn, and quite unrecorded anywhere but here, that Hester Ballard carried her father's fear as well as her own, and let him see only the one, and held his hand steady upon the pen when it shook, and told him every night that all would be well, upon the strength of a tide book and a conviction that the water does not lie. Her one ally of any weight was old Riggs, the tide waiter, and he was an ally chiefly in the sense that a rock is an ally to a man clinging to it in a sea, immovable, unbeautiful, and exactly where you had left it. Riggs had boarded the incoming ships upon the Raybar for 50 years, man and boy, and had taken the soundings with his own lead and his own knotted line every making tide of that half-century, in fog and frost and the black of the morning. And he carried the depths of that creek in his head the way another man carries the Lord's Prayer. He had no opinions upon the science of commerce, and none upon the freedom of trade, and would not have crossed the road to hear Mr. Prout read his prospectus, but he knew to the inch how much water the neap left on the bar, and he could no more have been got to swear there was 9 feet on it than to swear the moon was made of Cheshire cheese, and he had for the wharfinger's daughter the gruff, total, unspoken loyalty of an old servant of the tide for the one young person left in the parish who valued the thing he had given his life to. When it came at last to the pinch, it would be old Riggs's lead line and old Riggs's 50 years standing up beside her book that a court could not laugh away. The Grand Bassin was a different notion altogether, and a very modern one. Mr. Prout's beautiful prospectus had shown, and the whole coast had believed it, because it was printed, and because there were pillars, that the future of the bonded trade lay not in a string of little tide-bound wharves, each taking one ship at the top of the water, but in a single great basin dug below the town, with gates to hold the tide in, so that any vessel of any burden might lie afloat at its quays at any hour of the day or night, and discharge at her leisure. It was, upon paper, unanswerable, and paper was the element in which the whole coast had lately learned to live. It was also, as Hester Ballard had seen at a single glance, and said once, quietly, to a room that was not listening, a machine built for the running of goods, for a basin that floats any hull at any hour, is a basin at which a cargo may be landed, and a cargo may be shifted. In the dark of the night as easily as in the eye of noon, with no honest falling tide to say when a thing was done, or whether it was done at all. A wharf where anything may happen at any hour, she had thought, is a wharf where a clever man may make anything appear to have happened at whatever hour best suits him, and she had looked at the deep black gate-kept water of the new basin, and at the smooth sandy gentleman who superintended it, and had felt the first cold touch of a suspicion she had then no evidence for, and no leave to speak. But that was an objection upon the theory of basins, and nobody upon that bright October forenoon, with the collation laid out and the fortunes as good as made, had the smallest wish on earth to hear it. Of the Viscount himself it is only fair to say that he was neither a fool nor, at the bottom, a knave, which is precisely what made the whole business possible, for a fool would have been found out the sooner, and a knave would have watched his own back door, and Crispin Dacre did neither, being merely a clever, cold, well-read, and thoroughly modern gentleman of about 35, who had come into an old title and a mortgaged estate, and meant to mend the second with the credit of the first. He had read his political economy in town and believed every word of it. He thought a reserve of gold in a strong room so much money asleep, and a cellar of unsold bonded goods very nearly the same. He reckoned the old sufferance wharves a picturesque survival, like the stocks upon the green, and their keepers a set of superstitious tide-watchers who confused the almanac with the Almighty. He had never in his life boarded an incoming ship upon a making tide, nor counted a bonded cellar at 6 of a winter morning, nor stood upon a quay and watched the ebb steal a hull down onto the mud until she lay over on her bilge like a stranded whale, and it had therefore never once occurred to him that a man who did those things might know something that a man who had read Mr. Prout's prospectus did not. He had taken the basin's affairs, as a nobleman takes such things, upon trust, and had put the whole running of them into the hands of the one man on that coast, who understood to a nicety exactly how much such trust was worth. That man was Mr. Silas Kite, and he wore 2 hats, which ought by rights to have been the first thing anybody looked at, and was in fact the last. He was the king's own tide surveyor for the port of Weymouth, the officer set to oversee the tidesmen who boarded every vessel that came over the bar, to see the duty done and no cask run, and he was also, by an arrangement that the Viscount thought very convenient and Hester Ballard thought very strange, the salaried superintendent of the Grand Basin, which is to say that the same gentleman who was paid by the Crown to catch the running of goods was paid by the Basin to bring the goods in. He was a smooth, dry, obliging, sandy man of middle age, with a soft step and a good coat and a way of being always just behind the shoulder of whoever mattered most in the room. He kept his own landing books in a hand as neat as copperplate and as false as a bad shilling, and he had understood, long before the first stone of the basin was laid, that a deep waterquay, where any hull might lie afloat at any hour, was the finest instrument for the quiet running of undutied spirits that the wit of man had yet contrived, and that the surest way to keep the king's officer from ever looking into the basin was to be the king's officer himself, and to keep the whole coast looking, instead at somebody else. He had marked the little wharf of Ballards for that somebody a good while before he needed it, the way a prudent housekeeper lays by a joint against a lean week, and he had marked the wharfinger's daughter too, as the one person on the coast with the wit to undo him, and had smiled at her the more warmly for it. Within the week of the opening, the Viscount's man of business waited upon Gideon Ballard with a handsome offer to buy up the little wharf, its license, its lease, and its goodwill. And to close it, the Bassin, he explained, could not be expected to share the creek's trade with a set of tide-bound survivals, and it would be kinder to the old gentleman, and more prudent, to take a fair price now than to be dug out by degrees, and left at last with a mud berth and a painted board. Old Gideon, ailing that autumn and easily frightened, would very nearly have signed. It was his daughter who read the deed through twice, set it down, and observed, in the level voice that the town found so unwomanly, that she thanked his lordship, but that a wharf which had paid the king his due for 40 years was not a cottage to be pulled down for a view, and that they would keep their license and their lock and their good name, and answer for all three the day anybody cared to ask. And then she did the thing that made the coast quite certain she had gone at last out of her senses. She took the small sum her father had put by, and instead of hoarding it against the lean winter the Basin promised them, spent it, quietly and to the last shilling, upon keeping her cellars honest and her duty paid to the very day, laying in nothing on credit, owing the crown not 1 hour's grace upon a single cask, so that whatever else the winter might bring, no man living should ever be able to say that Ballards owed the king a farthing. It could not pay across the counter the instant it was asked. The tide book itself deserves a paragraph to stand in, for it is the true hero of this history, and it is not often that a hero may be had for the price of a ledger and 40 years of not once telling a lie. It was a great, long, calf-bound book, or rather it was by now a whole shelf of them, worn soft at the corners, and swelled with damp and salt, and the turning of 10,000 mornings, and it was written in more hands than one, for old Gideon had kept it before her, and his own father before him, so that the ink went from a faded brown in the early leaves to the firm black of her own careful copperplate at the end. And no single soul alive could have altered one line of it without altering 100 lines about that one, in inks that no longer came in any bottle and hands that were 20 years in the churchyard. In it stood every tide that had served that creek in living memory, the height of the water over the bar, and the hour it made, and the hour it fell, checked morning and evening against the printed almanac, and against old Riggs's own soundings with the lead, and against the tides stood the ships, and against the ships their drought, and their berth, and their business, so that a person who could truly read it, and there were perhaps 3 living who could, and one of them was a woman the Viscount had sent to the Fishquay, could say of any night in 40 years exactly how much water had lain in that creek, and therefore exactly what could, and what could not, have floated in it. It was not an almanac. It was the creek's own sworn memory, and it could not be bribed, and it could not be bullied, and it would very shortly be laid open upon a long table before a great many gentlemen who had been entirely sure it was a fishwife's toy. Through the short darkening days of that autumn the coast had its joke, and made the most of it as coasts will. The Ballard girl was hoarding her cellars honest, while the marble Basin floated the whole trade at any hour it pleased. The Ballard girl had turned down a lord's good money to sit tide bound on her mud and weigh her farthings. The Ballard girl kept a book of the water, like an old woman keeping a diary of her dreams, and thought it would answer the great new gentleman from London. The trade that had brought its honest cargoes to Ballards for 40 years took them, cask by cask, down the creek to the deep quay where a ship need not wait upon the moon. The little wharf's business thinned to a trickle of the timid and the old-fashioned, and Hester Ballard went on weighing her duty true, and paying the king to the day, and reading her tides by candle in the cold counting-house of an evening, and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say, and because she had noticed that the persons who most enjoy telling a careful woman she will be sorry are precisely the persons who will be gone from the quay when the water proves her right. There is a loneliness peculiar to being the only person in a place who can see a plain thing, and Hester Ballard had lived inside it so long that she had stopped calling it by any name. She could stand upon the hard at the bottom of a neap and see, laid out as plain as a printed page, the whole geography of what could and could not be done upon that creek that night. Which berth would float, and which would be a bed of ooze, which vessel might come up the fairway, and which must wait below the bar, while the fashionable world 100 yards off at the basin saw only deep water behind a marble gate, and reckoned the moon a thing for poets and old women. She had given up, years since, expecting to be believed upon sight, and had learned instead the harder and the more useful art of being able to prove it afterward, and she kept her book, night upon night in the cold, not for any credit it brought her, for it brought her none, but for the same plain reason her father had kept it, and his father before him. Because a thing that is true ought to be written down truly by somebody, against the day when a great many people who had found it convenient to forget it would need to be shown. She was not a martyr about it, and she was not, whatever the parlors chose to say, a cold woman. She felt the slights, and the empty encounter, and the long odds standing against an old man and a girl and a book. But she had made, somewhere in her steady heart, the one wager that never yet failed the person with the nerve to lay it and the patience to hold it, that the truth keeps like sound coin, and comes round again with the tide, and she meant to be standing there, book in hand and her duty paid to the day, upon the morning it came round. The blow, when it fell in December, and it was beautifully aimed. There had been a great seizure of run spirits away to the westward, and a stir in the newspapers, and a stir behind the newspapers in town, and there came down to every port upon the coast a sharp order that the collectors were to look to their bonds and account for every gallon. For a nervous board is a hungry board, and wants above all things a culprit it can hang up in print to show thee, country, that it is awake. Mr. Silas Kite, whose own basin cellars would not have borne the counting for a single quarter of an hour, understood the danger to himself precisely, and did the thing a cornered clever man always does. He found the board its culprit, and took particular care that the culprit should be somebody else. He had his joint laid by. He had only to carry it to the table. And so an information was laid, sworn, regular, upon the neatest of copperplate landing books, that upon the night of the 14th of November last a lugger called the Sparrowhawk, well known upon that coast for a runner, had come up the creek upon the flood, and lain alongside Ballard's wharf, and had there landed 500 kegs of undutied French spirits, which the said wharf had taken into its cellars, and afterward cleared away by the back in the water in the small hours, without benefit of the king's officer or the king's duty, and that the tide surveyor, coming upon the traces too late, could show the empty marks in the mud, a parcel of broached anchors, and a bond ledger of Ballard's own. How it had come into his hands he was very ready to explain, and never quite did, in which the entries for that fortnight had plainly been doctored to cover the run. It was as neat a thing of its kind as had ever been done upon that coast, and it had the one great merit of all Mr. Kite's work, that every separate piece of it was there to be handled and shown, and only the whole of it was a lie. It was, upon the face of it, ruin, and ruin of the completest and most respectable kind. Here was no vague slander to be lived down, but a sworn charge, in a king's officer's own hand, with goods to show, and a doctored ledger to prove intent, and the penalty, should it be made good, was not a fine but the end of everything, the license void, the lock struck off. The good name of 40 years gone in a night, old Gideon very like to end his last years in a debtor's cell for a king's debt of some thousands he had never owed, and the wharf itself forfeit to the crown and certain, as everybody understood, to be bought in by the one bidder upon the coast with a use for it. the Viscount of Ash, to whom the tide surveyor carried the matter first. As in duty and in cunning bound, did precisely what a modern gentleman who trusted his own superintendent's copperplate was bound to do. He believed it. He was sorry for it. He was not a cruel man, and there was something in the affair that sat ill with him, though he could not have told you what. But the books were the books, the goods were the goods. And a magistrate does not set his own sworn officer's word aside upon a feeling, and so he lent the whole weight of his name and his bench to the prosecution of Ballard's Wharf, and told his aunt at dinner, with a small frown he did not trouble to examine, that it was a bad business, but that the woman had brought it on the old man with her obstinacy, and there was an end of it. He came once to the wharf before the hearing, and it is worth the recording, for it was the high water-mark of his blindness, and he would blush for it afterward to the end of his life. He came. He was at some pains to make clear, out of a sort of chill benevolence, to advise the old man to submit, to give up the license quietly, plead his years, throw himself upon the mercy of the board, and be spared the worse ruin of a defense that could not succeed. And he addressed himself throughout to Gideon, and passed the daughter, as though she were a piece of the counting-house furniture that happened to be wearing a shawl. It was Hester who answered him. She said, very levelly, that they were much obliged to his lordship for his concern, but that they would be defending the charge, because it was false, that no vessel of the Sparrowhawk's draught had lain at their wharf upon the night named, nor could have, and that she would undertake to prove as much to any gentleman who would do her the honor of looking at the water instead of at her gown. The Viscount had smiled, not unkindly, which was somehow the worst of it, and said that he was sure Miss Ballard believed it, that a daughter's loyalty did her credit, but that the affairs of the revenue were not to be settled by a young lady's almanac, and that she would do better to spend the little time left in persuading her father to a prudence that might yet save him his liberty. And he had bowed, and gone, and left behind him a young woman who was not angry, quite, but who had put away his face and his smile very carefully in the same drawer of her mind where she kept the faces of masters who had sworn to knights the moon forbade, and had resolved, with a cold and perfect calm, that the Viscount of Ash should one day stand upon her mud and be taught to read. She did not weep, and she did not run to the basin to ask upon what terms the thing might be made to go away, and she did not, as 3 separate well-wishers advised, throw herself upon anybody's mercy at all. She sat down that same night at the long table in the counting-house, with a branch of candles, and the printed almanac, and the whole salt-swelled shelf of the tide-book, and did the one thing she had ever truly known how to do, which was to ask the water. The charge named a night, the 14th of November. "Very well," said Hester Ballard to the empty room, in the voice her father had taught her. "Let us see what the tide was doing on the night of the 14th of November, and whether it will swear to Mr. Kite's tale or to mine." And she turned back the heavy leaves to November, and set her finger upon the line, and went very still, in the way she had, as a person goes still who has heard, a long way off, the first note of a great piece of good news, and dares not yet believe her own ears. For the night of the 14th of November, in the year this history turns upon, had been the very night of the neap, the lowest and the least of all the month's tides, when the moon hangs at her quarter, and the sun and the moon pull athwart one another, and the sea can scarcely be troubled to come in at all. And upon that night, as her own hand had set down in the book, and as the printed almanac confirmed to the half-hour, and as old Riggs's soundings bore out to the inch, there had lain over the ray bar at the very top of the water no more than 7 feet, and in the berth alongside Ballard's Wharf a bare 5. Now the Sparrowhawk was a heavy-built running lugger that drew, loaded, above 9, and there is no seamanship in the world, and no oath either, that will float 9 feet of laden hull in 5 feet of water. She could no more have lain at Ballard's Wharf on the night of the 14th of November than she could have cast anchor in the marketplace. Had she so much as tried to come up the creek on that neap, she would have taken the ground a full mile below the town and lain over on her bilge with the ebb, in the plain sight of every soul in Weymouth, and stuck there helpless for the better part of 7 hours until the next flood floated her off, and 500 kegs are not to be landed at a wharf by a vessel that is lying on her side in the mud a mile away, with her keel turned up to the moon. The tide had not been there. And where the tide has never been, no cargo has ever come. Hester Ballard sat with her finger on the line a long while, in the guttering light, and felt the whole cold weight of the winter lift off her chest, not because she was saved, she was a long way yet from saved, but because she had asked the water a plain question, and the water had given her a plain answer, and there is a particular peace in that which no marble has ever bought. But she did not stop where a person less exact, or less angry, or less honest might have been content to stop, at the mere clearing of her own house, for her father had taught her that to prove a thing could not have happened in one place is only the half of a reckoning, and the whole of it is to ask, where then? It could. And she put that question to the tide book too, and the tide book answered it without the smallest hesitation. There was upon the whole of that creek, upon the night of the neap, exactly one berth in which 9 feet of laden lugger could have lain quietly afloat and discharged 500 kegs at her leisure in the dark, gates shut, the water held in against the ebb, and no honest falling tide to carry the tale away, and that berth was the deep-dug, gate-kept, any hour of the night quay of the Grand Bonded Basin. The very thing Mr. Prout's prospectus had praised to the skies, that the basin floated any hull at any state of the tide, was the very thing that damned it, for on the one night in the month when nothing whatever could swim at Ballard's, everything could still swim at the basin, and a run of goods that could not by the plain law of the moon have come ashore at the little wharf, could have come ashore at the great one as easily as milk is set down at a door. The tide surveyor had built the perfect instrument for the running of goods, and had then, wanting a scapegoat in a hurry, sworn the run had happened at the one wharf on the whole coast where the water itself would rise up in open court and call him a liar to his face. She did not mean to walk into the collector's court upon her own unsupported book, however true, for she knew to a nicety what a room full of gentlemen would make of a woman's ledger set against a king's officer's sworn word, and so through the short cold days before the hearing she gathered, patiently and without noise, every witness that could not be called obstinate, or unwomanly, or in love with its own father. She had old Riggs, who had taken the soundings upon that bar for 50 years, and had the lead lines word by heart, and who could no more be got to say there had been 9 feet on the neap than to say the sun had risen in the west. She had the printed almanac that any gentleman might buy for a shilling in Weymouth, and that no gentleman could accuse of a partiality for Ballards. She had Mr. Tolly, the harbor master, a slow and cautious man with no great love for the wharf, and a very great love for his own reputation, whose independent register of the heights agreed with hers to the inch, and who could be trusted, being cautious, to swear to nothing he was not entirely sure of. And she had, though she did not yet know the whole worth of it, the plain fact, plain to anyone who once thought to look, and nobody yet had, that the king's officer who swore the run had happened at the tide-bound wharf, was the very man who drew a second salary from the deep-water basin, where alone it truly could have happened. The night before the hearing was the worst of it, and it was her father who made it so, not from any want of love but from the excess of his fear, for old Gideon had got it into his poor aging head that they were ruined whatever the book said, that gentlemen would believe gentlemen, and that his daughter's cleverness would only anger the great and hasten the end, and he begged her, with tears, to give it up and sue for mercy while there was mercy to be had. And Hester Ballard, who had her own fear folded away small and cold beneath her stays, and did not mean to take it out where he could see it, sat with him by the fire, and held his shaking hand in both of hers, and told him, quite steadily, that she had read the water on the night of the 14th of November. That there had been 5 feet at their wharf, and the lugger drew 9, and that this was not cleverness, but arithmetic, and that no gentleman living, however great, could make 5 into 9 by wishing it, any more than he could make the tide come in at midnight, because it suited the revenue. "Trust the water, father," she said. "If you cannot for tonight, trust me. It has never yet lied to this house, and it will not begin now, before a lord." And the old man was a little quieted, and slept at last, and his daughter sat up the rest of that night with the almanac and the book. Not because she doubted them, but because she meant to be so entirely their master by morning that no smooth gentleman on earth should tangle her before the bench. The hearing was held in the long panelled room over the custom house, before the collector, Miss Dornford, and a bench of the trustees of the port, of whom the Viscount of Ashe was the chief, and the town packed itself in at the back to see the Ballard girl put down. For a coast that had carried its trade to the marble quay, all the autumn had a very human wish to be told it had been right to do so. Mr. Kite laid his case as smoothly as he laid everything: the copperplate landing book, the sworn information, the broached anchors, the empty marks in the mud, the doctored ledger, one neat piece after another set out upon the table, and himself sitting down at the last with the modest air of a man who regrets a painful duty faithfully done. And then Hester Ballard, who had been given leave to speak on her father's behalf chiefly because it was thought the spectacle would be diverting, opened the great salt-swelled tide book upon the table before them, and did not once, in the whole of the next half-hour, raise her voice. She read them the tide for the night of the 14th of November. She read them the printed almanac beside it, and Mr. Tolly's register beside that, and had old Riggs stand up in his one good coat and swear to the lead. She showed them, in figures a plain man might follow, that there had been 5 feet of water at the wharf that night, and that the Sparrowhawk drew above 9, and she asked the bench, with a courtesy a great deal worse to bear than any scorn, whether any gentleman present would undertake to float 9 feet of laden hull in 5 feet of water, for if any could, she said, she had a very great deal to learn about the sea that her father had not been able to teach her in 27 years, and would be glad to be instructed. And the long room, which had come to laugh at her, grew first very quiet, and then began, here and there along the crowded back of it, to do the very thing that the painters of such scenes so love, and chuckle in a slow dawning. Delighted disbelief, for the plainest farmer among them could see that a thing had been sworn, to which the moon herself forbade, and could feel the whole discredit that had been meant for the little wharf come sliding, in front of all their eyes, clean back across the creek toward the marble one, and could see, too, beginning to dawn upon them, one by one, the beautiful and terrible question of who, precisely, having sworn that false oath, must therefore know exactly where the true run had gone. It was here, at the very turn of the tide, that the thing happened which this kind of story always requires, and which is the last cruelty of a cornered clever man, for Mr. Kite, seeing the room go from under him, did not fold, but struck at the one joint in her armor that a woman keeping her own father's books must always leave bare. He rose, all smooth concern, and put it to the bench, more in sorrow than in anger, that they had before them no independent record at all, but only the private ledger of the accused house, kept these many years by the very person now reading so movingly from it, the old man's daughter, who had every reason upon earth to save her father's neck and her own bread, and every opportunity, sitting alone in that counting-house night upon night with the ink and the candles, to write into an old book whatever figures should best serve her turn at need. A woman's ledger, he said, with a little bow toward her, that was the worst single thing in the whole affair, was not evidence. It was affection with a pen in its hand, and he was very sure the bench would not strike down the sworn word of the king's own officer upon the strength of the unsupported almanac of a spinster in love with her own hearth. And Hester Ballard saw the Viscount of Ashe, who had been leaning forward, frowning, half won over, sit slowly back at that, his face closing like a door. The modern man's horror of being made a woman's dupe doing in one instant what all Mr. Kite's copperplate had failed to do, and she understood that she had been believed exactly up to the moment it became a question of trusting a woman's plain word, and not one heartbeat beyond it. She did not color, and she did not plead, and she did not, though she might have been forgiven it, tell the Viscount of Ashe to his face what she thought of a gentleman who could swallow a king's officer whole and strain at a tide table. She gathered her proofs instead into a squared and level row upon the table before them all, quietly, as a woman lays a cloth, the 40-year tide book in its 4 hands and its 3 inks. That no living soul could have forged backward through 100 entangled entries, the printed almanac that any laborer in the town might buy and check, Mr. Tolley's register, sworn to by a man who disliked her, old Riggs's lead line and his 50 years, and the one plain question into which the whole of them ran. "You need not take my book, my lord," she said, and her voice was as level as the table she had squared them on. "You need not take my word, I am, as the gentleman is so good as to observe, only a woman, and the book is only mine. Take the water's word instead. The next neap falls upon the turn of the new year. Bring the Sparrowhawk up this creek on that night, or any hull that draws her 9 feet, and lay her alongside my father's wharf if you can, and when she is sitting on the mud a mile below the town, with her keel turned up to the sky, as she will be, and every gentleman upon this bench has stood upon the hard in the cold, and watched her sit there, you may come to me and tell me that my almanac is affection with a pen in its hand. I keep the book. I have never once in my life kept it false. And the tide will keep it for me, my lord, whether you choose to believe me or no." And she closed the great cover upon the contested night, and made the bench a small, correct, unhurried curtsy, and took her father's arm, and walked the whole length of that packed and silent room, and out into the cold December afternoon, and left the water to argue the rest. The town did not know, going home that evening, quite what it thought, which for that town was a novelty amounting almost to an event. It had come to see the Ballard girl put down, and had seen instead a king's officer's sworn oath made to look like a thing the moon forbade, and a lord sit back with a shut face, and a plain woman offer to settle the whole matter by inviting the quality to come and watch a boat sit on the mud. Opinion hung that fortnight, as the tide itself hangs at the top of the flood before it makes up its mind to ebb, undecided and faintly ashamed of having been so sure. Wagers were laid at the anchor upon whether any hull would be brought up at the neap at all, and longer odds upon whether a lord would truly stand on a cold flat to watch it, and Mr. Silas Kite, who had staked everything upon the one calculation that no gentleman would ever trouble to check a woman's sum, went about that fortnight as smooth and sandy and obliging as ever, and told the Basson's directors that the affair would blow over, and was, for the first time in a long and careful career, entirely and fatally wrong about the one man whose measure he had failed to take. Here we must, for a while, look through the other window, for the story of that winter is the story of 2 people walking opposite ways, and the Viscount's road was the harder to walk, because he had made it himself and did not yet know it. He went home to Ashicombe Court that night in a very ill humor, and told himself with great firmness that he had done the correct and the only possible thing, that a magistrate cannot set his own sworn officer aside upon the strength of an old book and a woman's fine composure, and that if the tide table were truly as plain as she had made it seem, why then the law would find it out in due course without any help from him. But the modern gentleman had a flaw in him that the knave at his elbow had never once reckoned with, which was that he was, underneath the whole of his political economy, an honest man, and an honest man cannot for very long keep out the plain arithmetic of 5 feet and 9 once it has got in at the door. It got in at the door that night, and it would not go to bed. He found that he could not, when he tried, recall a single thing Mr. Kite had said with half the exactness with which he could recall a level voice, asking whether any gentleman present would undertake to float 9 feet of hull in 5 feet of water. He found to his very great annoyance that he believed her, and that the one thing now standing between him and the saying of it aloud was that he had already, before the whole assembled port, all but sworn to the opposite. He was too proud to send to her, and too honest to let it lie, and so he did the one thing left to a man in that unhappy case, which was to go, quite alone and telling nobody, and ask the water himself. The New Year's neap came in bitter and clear, and upon the short afternoon of it, the Viscount of Ash stood upon the cold hard below Weymouth in a plain greatcoat, with his collar turned up and no one by to see, and watched the ebb go out of the creek exactly as her book had said it would. He watched the mud come up out of the falling water, like a drowned country rising from the sea. He watched a laden coasting hoy that had mistaken her time take the ground a full mile below the wharf and settle, with a long groan of her timbers, over onto her bilge with her keel showing bare to the winter sky, in the very place the tide book said the sparrowhawk must have sat. And then he walked the length of the creek to the great gates of his own grand basin, and looked, and saw the deep black water lying there still and full behind them, at the very bottom of the ebb, deep enough to float a frigate, deep enough to have floated the Sparrowhawk and all her 500 kegs on any night of any month the moon ever made. He stood a long time between the grounded hoy and the brimming basin, a clever man doing at last, upon the cold mud and in the failing light, the one plain sum he had refused to do in the warm court, and when he had done it, he took off his hat, though there was not a living soul upon that flat to take it off to, and stood bare-headed a while in the sea wind, which is a thing honest men will sometimes do when they have understood, too late to be proud of it, a thing they are ashamed to have understood so slowly. He did not go to her then. He was too newly ashamed for that, and too much in earnest, and he had grasped, standing between the grounded hoy and the full basin, that a feeling upon a mud flat would clear nobody, and that the thing wanted now was not an apology, but a reckoning that would stand in law where a woman's book had been laughed at. So he went home, instead, and did the harder and the more thorough thing. He called for the whole of the Grand Basin's books, every ledger and landing account and cellar tally since the laying of the first stone, and he sat up with them 3 nights running. No longer the picturesque proprietor who took his superintendent's copperplate upon trust, but a cold and careful man adding a very long column he devoutly did not wish to reach the bottom of. He was better at figures than Mr. Kite had ever given a lord credit for being. That was another measure the smooth man had failed to take. And on the 3rd night he reached the bottom of the column, and sat looking at it a long time by the light of a burnt-down candle, and understood that he had been robbed in his own house for 2 years by the very servant he had preferred, before the whole port, to an honest woman with a true book. For he found the cellars that could not possibly hold what the books swore they held. He found the duty entered as paid over that no collector had ever in fact received, and when at last he sent, humbly enough, by a plain note and a plain messenger, to borrow a fair copy of the Ballard Tide Book, and laid the Basin's own landing nights beside it, he found the whole shape of the thing at a glance, the way a man sees a face in a puzzle once it has been pointed out, and can never afterward unsee it. Upon a full dozen of the darkest high-water nights of those 2 years, when the tide book showed deep water standing in the gated basin and mud lying bare at every honest wharf on the creek, the Sparrowhawk and her sisters had lain quietly at his own deep quay and run their cargoes clean away under the very nose of the king's officer, who was the king's officer, and drew the basin's salary besides, and had kept his 2 neat sets of books for 2 years against the certain day of reckoning, because he had always, from the very first stone, meant to have a little tide-bound wharf across the creek, stood ready to be blamed. The Viscount of Ash had been made a dupe, sure enough, and thoroughly, but not, it turned out, by the woman. He had been made a dupe by the one man on the coast whose word he had preferred to hers, for the single and sufficient reason that the one had worn a king's coat and the other had worn a gown. The taking of Mr. Silas Kite was managed quietly, and without any of the drama the town would so have enjoyed, which was itself a kind of justice, for he had traded all his life upon appearances and was allowed none at the end. The Viscount laid the whole of it, his own books, the borrowed tide book, the 12 marked nights, before the board's own solicitor, and before an inspector sent down expressly from town, and stood the racket of it like a gentleman, making no attempt whatever to shelter his own name behind his superintendence, which cost him a good deal and raised him, in the 1 quarter he had come to care about, more than it cost. Mr. Kite, presented of a grey morning with a reckoning kept in a truer hand than his own, and grasping in an instant that the game was wholly up, did the only prudent thing left in his repertoire, and made a bolt for the packet, and was taken upon the very quay of the deep basin he had built for his frauds, in water that would have floated any hull at any hour, and there, one is glad to report, at the top of a fine full flood, could not for the life of him find a boat that would carry him off. He kept neither of his 2 hats. He wore in the end a third that the Crown provides at its own charge for gentlemen who defraud it, and passed out of this story, and out of the county, together, and so we come round, as was promised at the outset, to the plain oak counter of Ballard's Wharf, on a raw bright morning at the very end of that winter, and to the Viscount of Ash, standing at the honest side of it, with his tall hat held in both his hands against his breast, and no rank left about him that he cared just then to stand upon, a man come to speak and not to command. She was weighing out the duty upon a parcel of tea for a farmer's wife when he came in, and she finished it first, to the farthing, and gave the woman her change and her good morning, because the king's business waits upon no viscount. And only then did she set down her pen and look at him across the counter with the clear attending look that weighed what was said against the truth of it, and wait. He found, having rehearsed a great deal upon the road, that he had almost nothing to say, and that the little he had was the only thing worth the saying. He had come, he told her, to say that she had been right, upon every particular, from the first morning under the awning to the last word in the court, that the water had kept her book for her, exactly as she had said it would, and that he had been down to the mud himself and watched it do so. That Kite was taken, and the basin cellars sealed, and her father's name as clean as the tide could wash a thing, and that he had learned, a very great deal later than he ought, the difference between the front of a thing and the back of it, and between a man's coat and a man's word. He did not ask her to forgive him. He was too honest to suppose forgiveness was his to claim before it had first been earned, and too newly humble to imagine that a handsome apology was a coin that would weigh in that particular scale, and it was precisely this, that he came asking nothing, and offering only the plain admission that he had been wrong and she right, which first made Hester Ballard look at the Viscount of Ash as though he might after all be a man worth the reading, and not merely a lord worth the outwitting. He came back after that through the lengthening spring, and he came in a manner she had not looked for and could not for a good while make out. for he did not court her as the particular sort of suitor courts a solvent wharfinger's daughter, with which sort she was wearily familiar, but as an ignorant man courts a thing he has decided, late and humbly, that he wishes at last to learn. He asked her to teach him the water. He would come down of a morning and stand at the honest side of the counter and ask, quite seriously and with a pencil in his hand, why a spring tide made up so much higher than a neap, and what the moon could have to do with it, and how a person might read out of the book what the creek would give a vessel upon a night 3 weeks off. And she, who had never once in her life been asked by a gentleman to explain the single thing she understood better than any gentleman upon that coast, found herself explaining it, and found, to her own very considerable surprise, that she liked the doing of it, and that a man who will stand still and be taught a hard true thing by a woman, and thank her for it without a flourish, and come back the next morning to be taught the next thing after it, is a rarer and a better creature than a man who arrives already possessed of everything. Worth the knowing. The town watched the whole of this over its blinds with an enormous and undisguised interest, and drew, for once, the correct conclusion a good while before the parties to it did. And somewhere in that spring, between the almanac and the lead line and the long slow tides talked over across a plain oak counter, the needle that had swung so decidedly off him in October, the morning he sent her to the fish quay to sell her opinions for herring, swung quietly back and settled, against her every expectation and her own dry judgment of herself, upon a bearing she had years before struck off her private chart as a thing not to be looked for in this life, and being an honest woman, and out of practice at pretending, she read it where it truly pointed, and did not trouble to pretend to herself that it pointed anywhere else. The public setting right of it, when it came, was as complete as the private, and a great deal more diverting to the town, which had now, with the beautiful consistency of towns, always known that the Ballard girl was worth 10 of the Marble Basin. Before the same bench and in the same long room, the charge against Ballard's wharf was dismissed with the collector's own apology, read aloud. The great king's debt of some thousands, that had so nearly carried a frightened old man to a cell, was struck off, and shown to have been from first to last a creature of Mr. Kite's own ink, and the tide book of Ballard's, that a Viscount had called a fishwife's almanac and no evidence, was entered upon the standing record of the port as good and sufficient evidence in the matter of the water, and remains so entered, for aught I know to the contrary, to this day. Old Riggs was thanked by name from the bench, and went out very red and gruff, and would not speak of it after, though he kept the newspaper that named him to the end of his days. And Gideon Ballard, who had begged his daughter the night before the hearing to give it all up and sue for mercy, wept again in the same chair by the same fire, but for the mending of things this time, and not the ruin of them, and told her, which was the sweetest wage she had of the whole business, that her mother would have known she was right, having been, he said, much the same sort of woman, and much too good for him. As for the grand bonded basin, dug so deep and floated so high, it was found to have been from its very first stone exactly what its own superintendent had built it to be, a fair and costly front over a hollow and dishonest trade, and the very depth that had been its whole boast became, by a justice too neat for any novelist to have dared invent, the instrument of its ruin. For no honest merchant would leave his goods any longer in a cellar that had run undutied spirits under the king's own nose, and no underwriter would insure them there, and the marble quay that had drawn the entire trade of the coast in the golden autumn stood empty and echoing by the spring, its fine gates greening, its deep water lying still and full, and of use to nobody upon earth. A monument to the great truth that a place where anything may be done at any hour is a place no careful man will trust with anything he minds losing. A mile up the creek, meanwhile, the plain oak counter of the little tide-bound wharf that could take a ship only at the top of the water did more business in that one spring than it had seen in the 40 years before it. For the whole coast had discovered, at the basin's expense, that it would a very great deal rather wait upon an honest tide than be floated at any hour by a rogue, and that the slowness of a thing you can trust is worth more in the end than the speed of a thing you cannot. As for the Viscount of Ash, he did the sensible thing, which was for once the honest thing too, and which cost his pride exactly what it was worth and not a penny of discount. He did not close the little wharf, and he did not swallow it. He proposed instead, first and very correctly, to Gideon Ballard across the counter, and then, at very much greater length, and with very much less composure, to Gideon Ballard's daughter. Upon the selfsame hard where he had stood bareheaded and watched the hoy take the ground, a partnership of the two houses, the basin's deep quay and its capital joined to the old wharf's unforgeable name and its truer book, the one to float the ships and the other to keep them straight, and neither, he was at considerable pains to say, to be in any particular the master of the other. It was observed by his aunt, the formidable old dowager, who kept his house and her own counsel, that his lordship, who had gone down to the coast in the autumn to buy up a nuisance and pull it down, had come back up to town in the spring, proposing to marry it, and when she asked him, with the full weight of the family plainness, what upon earth he could have meant that first morning under the new awning, by sending a young woman who could read the tide to the fish quay to sell her opinions for herring, the Viscount of Ash was heard to reply, after a long and thoughtful silence, and with the nearest approach to true humility his aunt had witnessed in the whole course of his life, that he was hanged if he could now remember having meant anything whatever by it, and that he had come to suspect it was the least defensible remark of a knot, upon the whole wholly defensible life. She took him, in the end, but she took him upon her own terms, and in her own good time, and she named the terms plainly, at the counter, with the ledger lying open between them, as she would have named the duty upon a cask of Hollands. She would not be married out of gratitude for a wharf saved, she told him, nor to mend a name, nor because a lord had come at last to a woman's counter, with his hat in his hand, and a whole coast standing by to see how the story ended. She had saved the wharf herself, with the water's help, and none of his, and could keep it saved. She would marry him, she said. If she married him, as one honest house joins another, upon a fair and equal footing, with the book kept open and in her own keeping, she would go on weighing her own duty and reading her own tides to the very end of her life, viscountess or no viscountess, and dinner tables be hanged, and the first time he set a man's fine coat above a plain true word again. In her hearing or out of it, he would find that she had read the water on him too, and that it stood exactly where it stood, and not one finger's breadth higher for his being a lord. And the Viscount of Ash, who had told her in October that a tide book was a fishwife's almanac and no evidence, bowed his head over the fishwife's almanac and its keeper, and said that those were the only terms in the world he had any wish to marry upon, and that he thanked God and the neap tide for the mercy of being allowed them at all. They were married very quietly the following autumn, a full 12-month from the morning under the awning, in the small grey church upon the hill above the creek, with old Riggs in his one good coat, and Mr. Tolly the harbour master and half the honest trade of the coast crowded into the narrow pews, and Gideon Ballard giving his daughter away with a hand that shook this time for gladness and not for fear. It was remarked by the few who were there, and told afterward by a great many more who were not, that the bride carried no flowers, but a small worn brass tide gauge folded in her glove, which nobody present but her husband and old Riggs rightly understood, and which made the Viscount of Ash, waiting at the rail, look for a moment like a man who has been handed the whole round world in a plain and shabby case, and that when the parson came to the part about the two being made one estate, his lordship glanced sidelong at the composed woman beside him, with the expression of a gentleman who knows to the last farthing what a bargain he has had, and cannot for his life account for his luck in the getting of it. She did not take his arm going out. She walked beside him, level and unhurried, an honest handsbreadth of daylight between them, two sound houses joined upon a fair footing, and neither of them the master of the other. Precisely as the deed of their partnership had been drawn, and precisely as she had told him at the counter it must be, and if that was not the tale the storytellers wanted, the great lord sweeping the pretty nobody off her feet in a swoon of grateful surrender, it was a better thing, and a truer, for it was the joining of two people who had each of them, in the hardest winter either had ever known, found out beyond any further doubting exactly what the other was worth, and had chosen it with their eyes open and the book kept between them. The wharf kept its name. She would never once hear of its being altered, and in time the name altered its own meaning, as names will when the thing behind them is made good, until Ballards meant, from the Downs to the Nore, and wherever a careful merchant warehoused a cask, not a little tide-bound survival upon a muddy creek, but the soundest bonded house upon the whole of that coast. The one wharf that had never in living memory cost the king a shilling of his duty, nor a merchant a farthing of his goods, and that had read the tide true in the great frame-up of the basin, when a viscount and a king's officer between them could not. The Viscountess of Ashe kept her own books and read her own tides to the end of a long life, and the ink upon her fingers scandalized 3 generations of dinner tables, and her husband, who had once thought a full cellar and had kept reserves so much money asleep, was heard at those same tables, whenever a fine new scheme, or a deep new basin, or a beautiful printed prospectus was laid before him, to ask first, always, in the plain family voice his sons and daughters learned to imitate lovingly behind his back, "Yes, yes, but what is the tide doing? Will it float at the bottom of the ebb, or only at the top of the water? Show me the water first, and then, if you please, we will talk of the marble." 2 objects outlasted the principals, and are the proper end of this story. In the shallow drawer of her writing desk, folded once, neat as she folded everything, there lay the first leaf of the Grand Basin's own landing book that had ever been set beside her tide book in open court, with a slip pinned to the back of it in her own firm hand, recording what old Riggs had said upon the hard the afternoon the hoy took the ground and the Viscount stood bareheaded in the wind, that the water was an honester officer than any the crown ever swore in, for it could not be bought, and it would not be hurried, and it told the very same tale to a lord, and to a fishwife, and to a king. And upon the library mantel at Ashicombe Court, between the porcelain and in some defiance of it, there stood a plain worn brass tide gauge, no longer than a man's hand. Its graduated stem rubbed bright with 40 years and more of honest handling, and beside it, always open at the same leaf, the salt-swelled tide book itself, turned to the night of the 14th of November, where any guest who cared to might read, in a woman's careful copperplate, that there had been 5 feet of water at the wharf that night and no more, and might reckon for himself how much laden lugger will swim in 5 feet, and so have the whole of the story for nothing, as she once gave it to a viscount for nothing, at the price of a small correct curtsy, that the sea keeps a truer book than any man, and can be neither flattered nor frighted into swearing to a lie, that the water stands where the moon appoints it, and stands nowhere else, and that where the tide has never been, no gentleman's oath and no grand new company will ever float so much as a ship's boat, though they pave the whole quay with marble to say otherwise. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.